Well, good morning, students. Uh, the next topic that I'm going to deal with is Preface to Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth. This Preface to Lyrical Ballads by William Wordsworth is a kind of a foreword or a preface that has been added to lyrical ballads. Lyrical ballads is a collection of poems which was published first in 1798. Wordsworth published these poems in collaboration with Coleridge, right? This publication marks a complete shift in terms of writing of poetry itself, right? So initially, when Lyrical Ballads was published, it was not received well by the readers, right? Why? Because it was completely and altogether a different kinds of poems that were written out there, right? So a quick look at what kind of poems were written before Lyrical Ballads will help you understand understanding as to how Lyrical Ballads have marked a shift from the previous kinds of writings, especially poetry, right? So if you look at the previous century, that is 18th century, you find that it's a neoclassical era. The writers of neoclassical era normally followed the classical writers, right, and have been quite punctual and very loyal in following the classical rules of poetry, right? So all these people like Pope, Dryden, and anybody before that, right? So they have very closely followed the rules of the classical writers. For them, the poetry was a very conscious process of writing. So they like it was like you need to have a lot of effort and sit down on a chair and table and then consciously make an effort to write a poetry, to write a poem, right? Keeping in mind all kind of meter that you are going to adopt, keeping in mind all kind of things that you are going to write. And the key factor in writing 18th century poetry was reason or logic or rationality, right? So you have to think, you have to reason in poetry, right? Apart from that, the themes that used to be dealt with in 18th century were the themes of urban reality, right? So the poetry in 18th century was an urban poet. It was about the middle class urban people, right? And you have to have use heroic couplet as the prescribed you know uh, prescribed form of poetry itself, right? So you have reason, you have urbanity, you have middle class, you have heroic couplet, right? These are certain things that were prescribed for 18th century writers. If you closely look at lyrical ballads by William Wordsworth and Coleridge, right, they have completely marked a shift from the previous kinds of writings, as I had said, right? So what kind of shift that these people have marked? Uh, First is that it is not about the urban people, it's not about the urbanity, it's about the rural people, the pastoral, right? You had a prescribed genre in 18th century that was heroic couplet. Now they have moved from there and have adopted lyric and any kind of liberalism in literature, right? Not following. So the genre has changed from heroic couplet to any kind of couplet, predominantly lyric, and the theme of the poem has changed from urban reality, middle class people, to rural people and rustic people and the common people, right? Apart from that, the language that was very ornamental and artificial in 18th century has now become a kind of ordinary language of day to day people, right? So you have seen a complete or tremendous change or shift, right? Uh, that was marked with the lyrical ballads, right? Now the question is, are people going to completely or suddenly accept it? I mean, the complete change. So of course the question is no, right? So of course, a little if you closely look at it, the lyrical ballad has not completely or suddenly exploded into a different kind of poetry, but you have seen a kind of a transition. that was existing in the transition poets like Blake, Cowper, and Gray, right? These were the transition poets who have indicated towards romanticism or aligned towards romanticism, but not completely romantic, right? So, but lyrical ballads have completely been different, right? So people did not receive it well. They didn't like it initially. So what happened was, Wordsworth had to come up with a preface to lyrical ballads in order to defend his poetry, right? So it's a kind of preface to lyrical ballads is a kind of a defense of Wordsworthian poetry, right? Wordsworthian theory of poetry. So it's a kind of a theory of poetry that Wordsworth had proposed, right? And it has asked people not to criticize him before actually reading it, actually reading his preface and his lyrical ballads, right? So it's a kind of defense that he has made in favor of his kind of poetry. So it has become a kind of romantic theory of poetry, right? There are a couple of things that uh, preface has advocated. The first is that it is a beginning of romantic movement, or you may call it romantic revolt, or you may call it romantic revival. Why revival is because if you look at 16th century Elizabethan times, they were also essentially romantic in nature. So that's why 19th century is not a new thing. It's just a revival of the 16th century romantic thing, of course with lot of difference, right? So it's a beginning of a romantic movement. Lyrical ballads has started romantic movement as such. Of course, the next point that it shows is that how a poem should be, right? It also has talked about the transition that has taken place from neoclassical era to romantic era, right? And also it's a kind of uh, uh, you know people do say that romantics were escapist, but if you look at this preface, I find it's a kind of a protest against all kind of scientific, uh, industrial and urban development, right? So the kind of urbanity that was being celebrated in 18th century is being protested. It's being protested in the romantic era, right? How? By highlighting, by foregrounding the rural, the pastoral, the unadulterated pastoral and rural life, right? So it's a kind of a pleasure which is being celebrated. It's a kind of a celebration of the rural and pastoral life, right? That is being defended. So you may categorize the entire preface to lyrical ballads in three main categories or headings or headlines. These are, first is qualifications of a poet, right? Who do you call a poet? Who is a poet, right? So the first thing it talks about is who is a poet, what is the qualification of a poet. The second thing it talks about is that what should be the language of a poem, what should be the language of a poem. And then the thirdly it talks about the themes of the poem or the topics of the poem, right? Uh, so so lyrical ballads, for the first it talks about who is a poet. So if you look at the qualification of being poet, you find it's completely different. If you look at 18th century writings, the poet is someone who is an elite, right? Who is different from a common man, who possesses a different kind of skills, right? Who possesses a different kind of qualification altogether, right? While if you look at the romantic poet, what kind of poet he is? He call it a man talking to a man, right? So a poet is a common man who is interacting with the common people, right? So the poet doesn't need to have much qualification, but he is just a common man. But little difference, like if you look at from the point of view of fancy and imagination, right? Fancy and especially imagination, of course primary imagination and secondary imagination, right? So fancy is somebody that everybody can do it, but it's not that simple. It's methodological. There are a lot of methods in fancy. Similarly, primary imagination is possessed by all, but secondary imagination is possessed by a special person, that is a poet, right? So poet needs certain kind of qualification, right? So it talks about, of course, the common human nature, the people, the common people, and their nature, right? It talks about the universal human reality, right? The common human nature. It also talks about low and rustic life, the common people, the village people, the rural people, the pastoral, right? And the poem is being written in Romantic era in the language of the rustic people, in the language of the day-to-day ordinary people, right? And to a certain extent, the it celebrates certain kind of revolutionary and democratic ideas, right? How democratic ideas is because democracy is the system or method which talks about the majority, right? Which talks about the rural pastoral, right? In extension of the knowledge to everybody around, right? So the rustic people, the rural people who have been excluded from all kind of knowledge formation, and whose experiences were completely relegated to as an unimportant, right? Romantic era tends to celebrate the experiences of the rural people. Hence, it is quite democratic in nature, right? It is quite democratic in nature, right? And you must be knowing about that French Revolution had a lot of influence on the Romantic era, right? So the French ideals, liberty, equality, and fraternity, right? The democratic ideals are very much accepted and celebrated, and have been used in the poetry of the Romantic people, right? So the Romantic, uh, the Romantic era is very democratic in its nature, right? And Preface and all the poems and lyrical ballads are, of course, doing and celebrating the Romantic ideal. So the first question is that what kind of language that the poet should use in his poetry, right? So it's called theory of poetic diction. Diction is language, right? So what kind of language a poem should uh, inculcate, right, or use. If you look at 18th century, there were certain kind of jargons, there was certain kind of complexity that was deliberately brought about by the 18th century poet, right? But the Romantic people have tried that the romantic poems, may be in a position to be read and understood and felt by the common people. And hence, they have deliberately chosen the language of the middle and lower class of the society, right? And what kind of day-to-day conversational language of the middle class and lower class society. A selection of language which is really used by men. A selection of languages really used by men. And he says that its poetry is not a conscious process. It's not a very deliberate process. It's a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, right? So the poetry comes to you automatically. It just flows into your mind, right? So if you remember that we have earlier talked about in when Aristotle and Plato had this attack and defense on poetry, right? He says that poet is somebody who is divinely inspired, right? And in a fit of madness or moment, right? He composes poetry, right? So its poetry is not everybody's cup of tea. It's divinely inspired. It automatically flows into your mind, right? Uh, and this is being proven by Coleridge when he had written Kubla Khan, right? If you remember, there is a scene in Kubla Khan when he was divinely connected and writing this poem Kubla Khan, and suddenly somebody passes by and he gets disturbed and he couldn't resume writing the poem, right? So he calls it poetic frenzy. Poetic frenzy means it's a fit of madness, fit of moment when poet is divinely inspired and he creates poem. So it's a kind of a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, right? And it's also the expression of emotions recollected in tranquility, right? But and this is something which is being proven in Tintin Abbey by Wordsworth, when he says that it's not an immediate response, right? It's not an immediate response. Rather, the experiences are collected. They are kept in your mind, processed over a period of time, and then expressed, right? So in this process the experience becomes mature, right? This is precisely is being proposed in Tintin when he visited Tintin at a particular point of time, collected all kind of experiences, then processed it over a period of time, and then he had expressed them. And similarly you find it in Daffodils, right? He visited the jungle, and then daffodils, and then after a long period of time, when he was sitting quietly in his drawing room, he remembers that particular scene and then writes a poem, right? So the experiences are not immature, right? The experience is quite mature, right? And they are processed in your mind, and then they are expressed. And so far as the meter of poetry is concerned, these people have followed lyric. So any form of lyric, which could be elegy, which could be a sonnet, which could be anything, right? So this they have taken a kind of liberty from that of the 18th century people, who have not talked about rather prescribed a particular kind of a meter as such, right? So they have also chosen blank verse, right? Blank verse, you understand, these 5 feet stressed and unstressed syllables, right? So of course, so, and the next point that we had already pointed out before was reason and imagination. While 18th century completely was based on reason, these people have completely based on imagination. While the 18th century people have completely banked upon the urban experiences, the artificiality, these people have focused more on nature as such, right? Wordsworth, like Coleridge, has banked more on intuition, not reason, right? Should guide. He says that intuition should guide the poet, not the reason should guide the poets, right? And if you look at the entire works of Wordsworth, you find that it's more of an intuition or imagination, which is a guiding force, with Lucy poems or Chinternabe or anything of that kind, right? Your experiences should inspire, right? Experience should be a kind of a category of writing poems, right? You must believe and exploit sensibility of eyes and ears. So sound becomes more important, visual becomes more important in Wordsworthian poetry, and he seems to be defending all those kinds of things, because you do not find such kind of poetry in 18th century or before, right? So it was little difficult for a common man or common reader to actually digest this kind of poetry, and hence the both the poets have to come out, and especially Wordsworth, in order to defend his poetry as such, right? We'll continue with the second lecture on Wordsworth's preface. In the meantime, please watch this video, and if you have any doubt, any queries, you may just WhatsApp me or email me about that. Thank you students.